Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feast for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed. Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. What's up, everybody? Rob here. So what you just heard were the opening lines of the Iliad, one of the earliest poems in Western canon. It tells the story about the Greeks attacking Troy, which was a city in what is now modern-day Turkey, and this was all over a petty dispute between the Greeks, well, specifically the king of Sparta, a guy named Menelaus, him losing his wife to a guy named Paris, the prince of Troy, or one of the princes of Troy. And war breaks out, and you guys know all this stuff. If you don't know what the Iliad's about, I can't help you there. Now, as I'm sure you're probably aware, the Trojan War is a work of fiction. It never actually happened. However, the events around it do have some basis in history. The Greeks, and by the way, the Iliad and later on the Odyssey, never actually referred to the Greeks as Greeks. They're always referred to as Achaeans, but, whatever. They actually do have a minor basis in history, specifically about the Mycenaean civilization, a very warlike civilization that ruled over Greece during the later parts of the Bronze Age. And it was this warlike nature that eventually would inspire the epic works such as the Iliad. So without any further ado, a very brief look at Mycenaean warfare. Now, before I get started into it, I just want to point out that a lot of what we know, and I put that in quotes, about Mycenaean warfare comes from lots of speculation, incomplete records, and archaeological finds. There's very little in terms of written evidence, so we're just going to have to wing it. And this is all really just a very good guess. These are best guesses according to historians and people that are way more intelligent on this than I am. All right, here we go. Okay, now the Mycenaeans were not the first inhabitants of Greece. This actually goes to, a bunch of other Stone Age peoples, of course. But the first ones that we have any decent records on are the Minoans, who were focused around the island of Crete, which the Mycenaeans borrowed heavily in terms of their art and architecture. There were a ton of differences, however. The Minoans lived in a relatively egalitarian society in giant unwalled cities. The Mycenaeans, by contrast, like I mentioned, were an incredibly warlike people, which necessitated the ring of their settlements in giant stone walls. And also, unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans had very strict social stratification with commoners and a sort of nobility, kings and such. And basically, it resulted in numerous warlords ruling over their own petty kingdoms throughout Greece. Now, this is, of course, seen in the Iliad when Agamemnon assembles a coalition of various other kings. He's the High King, and they all are at least somewhat subservient to him. How much of this actually took place, it's hard to say, but suffice it to say that military prowess was definitely a requirement amongst the leadership of the Mycenaean civilization. Now, one of the mainstays of warfare during the late Bronze Age was use of the chariot. At the legendary Battle of Kadesh, which is the earliest battle that we have available to us that we can recreate, which actually occurred roughly around the time that the historical fall of Troy happened, whether that was through invasion or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. In any case, at the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites and the Egyptians basically used their chariots as weapons platforms, sniping at opponents with bows or javelins or other type of ranged weaponry, and then running down the fleeing enemies afterwards. Now, the Mycenaeans also made extensive use of chariots, as you can see right here. Unlike their Hittite and Egyptian counterparts, however, Mycenaean chariots worked a bit differently. Instead of using them as mobile weapons platforms, the Mycenaean chariots would be used as basically, kind of like a battle taxi, almost like an armored personnel carrier. The warrior in question with his driver, usually these are two-person chariots, they would drive up to the battlefield. The person in charge, usually the nobleman, would dismount, get off of the chariot, fight on foot, and then at that point, if problems arise and he has to get out of there real quick, the chariot becomes an escape pod. He jumps on board the thing and he gets out of there. Now, chariots were expensive items, so having one was a status symbol, and it was, in addition to its tactical flexibility, like this, you can be fresh to the fight. You don't have to walk around everywhere. Also, it's a way to show off like how wealthy I am, that kind of thing. It's interesting to note that in the Iliad, the chariots would often arrive very close to the battle line. Numerous people, I think it was Hector's charioteer, I might be wrong, maybe Odysseus's, I really don't remember. It's been ages since I actually read the Iliad, Any case, their charioteers, the guys actually driving the chariot, would be shot at by arrows and would actually be hit by arrows and javelins and various other missiles. So, yeah, they would actually show up like right there in the thick of fighting, and then unload their the noblemen or whoever it was they were carrying, and get out of there at that point. But yeah, they would drive up right to the front of the battle. So whether this was common occurrence or if it was poetic license by Homer, who knows? But it is interesting to think about. Now, once arriving on the battlefield, it's important to remember the single most important rule of warfare: don't die. And in order to facilitate this, you had to wear armor. Now, armor in the Iliad is never really described in too much detail. However, it is usually depicted as being made out of bronze, at least for the nobility. Occasionally, gold armor is talked about, but that would be ludicrously expensive and extremely heavy. And actually, gold really does not make that good of it's just too soft. It really wouldn't make that good of armor. It's probably just to show the wealth of the people involved. I know Diomedes traded out his armor to a Trojan who his grandfather showed hospitality to, and he got gold armor out of the deal. Yeah, how much did gold armor actually exist? No, I highly doubt it. Maybe like gold leaf or something, but whatever. But yeah, it was almost exclusively made out of bronze, at least the good stuff. And what you see there is known as the Dendra Panoply. And the Dendra Panoply is an archaeological find, and it is made of 15 plates of bronze, which would be connected by leather. There's also it doesn't show it here, but there are also greaves and forearm armor that are also available with this. And something that just strikes me particular about this piece of armor is if you look around the head area, or the neck specifically, the neck and lower jaw are very well protected. That's almost like a bever on like a piece of Gothic plate from the 16th century. That goes up, if you were to wear that, would go up right about to the level of about your nose, thereabouts. So the neck is actually extremely well protected in this particular setup. Why they put this much emphasis on it? Well, neck is a pretty vulnerable spot, and given the weapons at the time, usually they were of stabbing types, and the neck is a very vulnerable area. So yeah, it makes sense to really protect that particular area. All right, and what you see here is the right shoulder guard that was found in a Mycenaean tomb. Now, there are three possibilities as to what you see here, or how it got to be a single shoulder guard that was found there. The first possibility is that it was part of a larger set and the rest of it is simply missing. I find this hard to believe, given that bronze does not rust away like iron does. Therefore, it's hard to believe that you'd have something like this in such good condition and the rest of it just simply missing. So the other possibility is that it was there as just a single representative, like it's representative of armor. It's there for symbolic purposes in this tomb, which is possible. It's also possible, and this is my opinion, and the opinion of many others as well, that this is basically the only metal armor that would be incorporated by someone of either lower status or possibly just the rank and file, the ground pounder, the ground pounding grunts themselves. More than likely, the combatant who would wear this would be wearing something made out of either padded linen, something like a gambeson or an accan, or possibly leather armor made from presumably goat hide, and that these are perishable materials and simply dissolved away, leaving only the shoulder guard. Now, the right shoulder, there would be a priority to protect that particular area, so if somebody was going to have the extra expense of buying extra armor, it would be protecting the right side of the body, as that is the spear arm, the weapons arm, and the one you're basically making vulnerable every time you stab out with your spear or sword or whatever it is you're using. So yeah, rank and file stuff would probably be something like this, or might not even have this at all. It might just be, a padded linen coat or something of that nature, possibly of leather or goat hide. Now, the most important part of your body that you need to protect is your head, because without your head, well, the rest of you is not going to function all that well. So, in order to do so, the Mycenaeans came up with an ingenious way to keep themselves alive, and that would be using boar's tusks. And this is actually referenced in the Iliad on numerous occasions. And what you see here is a boar's tusks helmet. Now, the Dendra Panoply, as you saw up there, does have a helmet that was found with a helmet that was made out of boar's tusks. And they're surprisingly tougher than you would think. Slashings and stabbing wounds from swords and spears and such would actually, boar's tusk would 100% deflect it. It's not as durable as metal, but it would certainly, it'll do the job. Now, metal helmets were available as well. They would again be made from bronze, and like it's mentioned in the Iliad, they would often be covered with or have on attached to them very elaborate crests. More than likely, this was a symbol of rank, and like warfare throughout history, the bigger the hat, the bigger the crest, the more important the person in command was. At least that's a presumption, and hey, oh look, whenever you're on a battlefield of any kind before the modern era, you find the guy with the biggest hat, he's probably in charge. Now, full bronze armor, like we discussed earlier, would be for the nobles, the guys in charge. And as such, just simply owning one would be a major status symbol. So as is recorded in the Iliad, when somebody with armor would be killed, people would fight tooth and nail to get a hold of it. This actually happened to Patroclus or Patroclus, or however you pronounce Achilles' friend. He dies and Achilles snaps out of his funk. That guy. When he died, there was a major battle, and people would fight fiercely to recover and loot the bodies. So, having armor, was as much an economic statement and a social statement as it is a way to protect yourself. Alright, so now we got armor to keep people alive. Now we got to do is dish out some punishment to your enemies. And the best way and the most common way to do this is with the spear. Now the spear is the most common weapon, or some kind of polearm is the most common weapon used throughout history, at least until the invention of gunpowder. And the Bronze Age and the Mycenaeans are no exception to this. And what you see here are a group of spearheads, and if you'll notice, they have a tang on the bottom of it. And these would originally be tied off to a long pole. Now this was kind of an earlier design, but it did carry on into the later parts of the Bronze Age until it was replaced by something like this. A spearhead that is one piece with a solid tube on the back end of it, which would be fitted onto the end of a pole of some kind, basically the spear shaft itself, and held in place with a nail. Now there are many, 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 many different types of spears and javelin heads and different lengths, anything from a few inches long to upwards of a foot, and they're just wider, shorter, double-edged kind of leaf blade like you see here, very triangular in design. They have central ridges, low central ridges. There's an entire typography about classifying them, and I'm not even going to remotely attempt to get into that. Suffice it to say that they would be used in one of two ways. More than likely, they would be used as throwing weapons, basically javelins, in which case they'd be, about 5 to 6 feet long, and would consist of much smaller, shorter heads. Like pretty much what you see here is probably a javelin head of some kind, and it would be made up of a lighter shaft, so it can be thrown much further and easier. There would also be dedicated thrusting spears, which would feature a larger, heavier, thicker head with a thicker, heavier shaft that's less likely to break off while you're using it. Now, the Iliad records Hector's spear at being something about 15 feet long when you convert it into modern units, which is, of course, patently absurd, but then again, Hector's, totally awesome, and yeah, other than diabetes, he's, my favorite character in the entire Iliad, but, whatever, another story. Any case, more than likely, the thrusting spears that you would hold on to would probably be about 7 to 8 feet long. Pretty much standard, typical stuff. And the Iliad does mention that they would be made out of ash wood, which, well, yeah, that actually does make a lot of sense. Ash is lightweight. It's reasonably lightweight, at least. It is very durable. It will not shatter that easily. It's got some flex to it, but at the same time, it is a pretty solid wood as well. So it's pretty much ideal for this sort of thing. So yeah, spears, it's a spear. It's basically a blade on the end of a stick. There's really not much to say about that sort of thing. Now, in addition to spears, swords would often be used, usually by the nobility. Now, there are multiple different styles, different lengths, different tang lengths, different cross sections, different blade patterns, etc., etc. The general trend amongst the swords, though, is that they are one-handed weapons, and though the blade lengths do vary greatly, they usually seem to max out about 2 feet or so. Now, something else that most of these different sword types have in common is the fact that the hilt of the sword, or the guard of the sword, is not particularly comprehensive. It's there mostly to keep the hand from sliding up and slicing the wielder's hand open, and not that much for protection. So, more than likely, these were not dueling blades, or something that you would use necessarily to parry an incoming blow, but more of something that you would use to give lightning-fast counters and ripostes to an opponent's more vulnerable areas. Now, what you see here are a group of swords from slightly earlier in the Bronze Age. I mean, still part of the later Bronze Age, but a bit of an earlier design. And they would be longer, thinner blades with a very pronounced central ridge, which helps strengthen it. And just given by the way the sword seems to be balanced, this would not be that good of a cutting blade. It just seems to me to be too narrow. More than likely, this would be used as a thrusting weapon, more than likely into the vulnerable parts of an enemy. If you go back to the Dendra panoply, that you'll see the neck armor is that extensive, probably because that was a vulnerable area. You have blades like this, the neck is a very vulnerable area you can thrust towards. So, yeah, this it seems to me that one would, the use of one led to the creation of the other. But yeah, these seem to be thrusting blades. Compare that to these blades that you see here, and these blades are almost certainly for cutting. They have a leaf-shaped blade, which facilitates a weight distribution for cutting, and probably not for thrusting. If you'll notice that the tips of the sword is somewhat rounded off, and you could thrust with it, yes, but it's not ideal, especially compared to the previous swords. And now we come to shields. Now, the shields of the various different types would more than likely be made from a wicker framework covered with hide and then edged with either leather or rawhide or occasionally bronze. Now, there are several different styles of shields. The two most popular and well-known are the rectangular tower shield that you see here, as well as the figure 8 shield, which you also see here. Both cover the entire body, or at least a very good part of it. And often it was used as a pavis, or something similar to a pavis shield for archers. If you go to the 15th and 16th century, crossbowmen would often have these shields. They'd plant them in the ground and then use them as a way to cover themselves while they were advancing on their enemy. And more than likely, they would be used in the same way here. This was actually referred to in the Iliad on several different occasions. Now, there are shorter shields as well, both round and square, and they would be shorter, roughly, standard shield size, wouldn't cover the entire body, and some were actually small enough to basically be considered something like a targe or a buckler, and they would probably be made from the same materials. Again, wicker covered with hide, more than likely goat's hide. It is presumed that the shields will be made of multiple different layers. Now, the amount of layers is cause for some speculation. If you have it too thick, you won't be able to move it. If it's too thin, it's not going to protect you. Now, famously, Ajax's shield had 7 different layers on it, and it was only the 7th layer that stopped the spear of Hector that was thrown at him from actually penetrating and killing him, which would imply to me, at least, that 7 layers is excessive because Ajax is an incredibly large, strong individual. So how many layers would it have? 2, 3, 4? I honestly have no idea. Most people don't. It would imply to me, though, that 7 layers would be seen as, if not excessive, at least a very large amount. And finally, we come to the use of bows. And while the Mycenaeans made use of the bow, archery doesn't seem to be a particularly prominent part of Mycenaean warfare. To give you an example of this, Odysseus famously left his bow behind in Ithaca while he went off to fight in the Trojan War. It just never even occurred to him that a bow would be a particularly useful thing to have. Although, ironically enough, Achilles, the great hero, would be killed by a bow, shot in the ankle. You guys know the story. And there was an Achaean soldier by the name of Teucer who was the half-brother of Ajax, and he basically used Ajax's giant tower shield as basically a pavis and was using that to pick off the Trojans, and actually it was him that picked off Hector's charioteer. Though later on in the Trojan War, his bow would be broken and he would have to resort to use of the spear, which would imply that he had to be pretty well-rounded, and relying simply on the bow was no way to go through a battlefield. Now, Mycenaean bows would be made from a combination of wood and horn, and honestly were not particularly powerful. These are not like the big yew bows that were used by the English, but rather something much, much less powerful, and probably really didn't have the range of anything too much more than a very well-thrown spear. That being said, they could be decisive if they were able to get their arrows on target, but generally speaking, Mycenaeans didn't have any particular great use of them. All right, now that we've covered the weaponry and other equipment used by Mycenaean warriors, we should briefly go over presumptive battle tactics of them. And most likely what happened is the armies would be drawn up towards one another, with the commanders arriving via chariot. Now, at this point, they would be at reasonably close range to each other, definitely within range of thrown objects at each other, and missiles and presumably insults would be exchanged. If you read the Iliad, you have very lengthy speeches by people saying, I am this person, son of this person, and I fought in these many battles, and I've, defeated this person, etc., etc. Now, more than likely, they wouldn't go on these very long, lengthy, personal histories, but at the same time, I'm sure they would be, going out there and bragging about how awesome they were. that certainly would have happened. Any case, they would be pelting each other with arrows and javelins, and of course stones. Slings are, presumably, I don't think any archaeological evidence of slings have been found, but the fact that slings, but if slings did exist in there, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. Also, I forgot to mention, as part of the missile weapons of this particular era, you have the simple rock. Yes, just a rock. It's not really, a designed weapon, obviously. It's just something you pick up off the ground and you hurl it at somebody. It's mentioned in the Iliad on multiple different occasions, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, you get whacked in the face with a rock. Yeah, it'll work as a weapon. Okay, so you have all these, both sides drawing up. They're throwing insults and stones and javelins and arrows at each other. And out comes the walking tank that is the commander or the nobleman in his full bronze panoply. Now, the best way to deal with a dude in full metal bronze panoply is to get your own guy in his full bronze metal panoply. And oftentimes it would presumably resort down to a battle of champions. One guy in full armor trying to battle against another guy in full armor. That's at least one possibility, with the rank and file going after the other rank and file, because, a guy in, the full panoply, like the Dendra panoply, up against a guy with padded linen and maybe a little bronze shoulder guard, no points for guessing who's going to win that one. Now, there is no mention of any particular type of formation. I think the word phalanx is mentioned in the Iliad once, and I think that's just meant to be, a reference to a group of individuals standing together in a military type setting. I don't think it was as formal or as organized as the Greeks would have in later centuries, and Homer, of course, was writing many centuries after the Iliad, so maybe that's an anachronism on his part. But they would be in some sort of formation. I would imagine they would be. I can't imagine them not being any kind of formation, but I doubt it would be as organized as, a very formalized phalanx. In any case, they would be hacking and slashing and stabbing at each other, and people would be dying left and right, of course. And when one side decided that they've had enough, they'd turn around and get out of there. Now, the nobles, like I said before, would use their chariots. They'd jump on there, and they would get out of there. Now, when your heavily armed and armored leader turns and runs, it's a good time for everybody else to get out of there as well. I've played enough RPGs. I played World of Warcraft, Rift, and Warhammer Online. And when the tank goes down, everything just seems to go to hell from there. So when this guy bolts and runs, or if he goes under, it's probably the end of the battle for that particular side. The victorious side would pursue as much as possible, but it just seems to me that there was more of an emphasis on plunder. You would go out there and just strip the battlefield of any valuables that may have been left behind, especially the armor of whoever had fallen on the battlefield. And pretty much like a good RPG, you kill people and you take their stuff. Now, something else that I didn't cover here, they wouldn't necessarily always fight pitched battles. Of course, random border skirmishes would be common as well. And there is significant evidence that the Mycenaeans were somehow associated with the Sea Peoples. Now, the Sea Peoples were a group of Viking-like raiders that terrorized the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean throughout that area, and may have been a contributing factor to the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. Now, I'm definitely going to be covering that in a future video, but suffice it to say the Mycenaeans might have absolutely participated in smash and grab style raids, showing up at an enemy's coast or a target's coast, leaving their ships, moving out, grabbing whatever is valuable, stealing slaves, and just generally making a mess of things, and then getting back on their ships and pulling out of there before any sort of real resistance showed up. So there's definitely a multifaceted part of their warfare. There were pitched battles, skirmishes, and possibly shipborne raiding as well. So there you go. So that's it for the video. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos will be coming out whenever I get around to it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Right, have a good day, or don't have a good day. You're adults, you can have any kind of day you want. I'm not going to stop you. See you later.